I'm John Torchari, the co-director of the International Policy Center, and I'm pleased to introduce the director of the International Institute, Pauline Luong. We thank the International Institute for bringing together this event, and also the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, which with the International Policy Center is co-sponsoring. So I'll turn over to Pauline, who will introduce our panel.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And welcome to the International Institute's roundtable on ISIS, Understanding ISIS, Evolution, Ideology, and Implications. This event, of course, would not be possible without the co-sponsorship of the International Policy Center, so thank you very much, John. And thank you to all the staff that also made this possible. Thank you to the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies for their co-sponsorship. Thank you to Thea Rowe, the program administrator at IPC. Thank you to Margot Lakin, our communications director for the International Institute. And thank you to Beth Discourse, for also the program specialist at CMENAS, for helping us put this all together and do it in a very short period of time. One of the things we're trying to do with these International Institute roundtables is to take a sort of ongoing international crisis or event and very quickly put together a panel of experts, mostly from our own faculty experts that are on the University of Michigan campus or within the state of Michigan. As you notice, one of our panelists is from Michigan State University, and we're very, very grateful to have him here. ISIS has gained increasing media attention and alarmed leaders around the world since June 2014, when it seized control of large swaths of territory in northeastern Syria and western Iraq and declared the establishment of an Islamic State. But this Islamist extremist group, also known as ISIL, or the Islamic State, has been growing in strength and popularity for several years, and some would argue the roots of its grievances are centuries old. This International Institute Roundtable brings together 4 experts to shed light on different aspects of ISIS, its ideology, its origins, its popular support, and the impact it has or is having on the international system. Our 4 panelists I will introduce in the order in which they are going to speak today. First, Professor Juan, who is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies and a professor of history here at the University of Michigan. Second, Professor Tessler, professor of political science and formerly the vice provost for international affairs at the University of Michigan. Professor Mohammad Khalil, professor of religious studies at Michigan State University and the director of the Muslim Studies program. And finally, James Morrow, professor of political science here at the University of Michigan. Before we begin, I want to ask you to please hold your questions until the end. And please feel free to write them down on the note cards that will be passed around the audience. You can address your questions to specific members of the panel or to the panel as a whole. I will read the questions from this podium and then ask the panelists to respond to those questions. We hope this will expedite questions and allow for as much discussion and participation from the audience as possible. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Juan.
Thank you, Pauline. Thanks to the International Institute and the Ford School for having this event. I'm going to start off by talking about Sunni grievances, and I call it ISIL, ISIS, rose by any other name. What I'd like to suggest is that the collapse of the state that we've seen in Syria and Iraq is primarily an economic phenomenon, and the conflicts that we are seeing in the region are primarily economic in nature. They have to do with the transition from, broadly speaking, socialist states, ones on somewhat the Soviet model, very large public sectors. In Iraq, there wasn't so much private industry until the 80s. As these countries have moved from, when you move from a socialist state to a neoliberal capitalist one, apparently you can do it right or do it wrong. So Argentina did it wrong, collapsed. Turkey, not so bad. Russia seems to be having trouble. So Syria and Iraq are situations where there must be some intervening variable between these political ideologies that accounts for why it can be done successfully or unsuccessfully. But in any case, I can't tell you what those are. I do know that as they moved from socialist states to neoliberal ones, they did it with corruption and insider trading, because in systems where the state controls the economy, if you privatize, then state actors are the ones that are privatizing, and they know where the good deals are. And if they're unconstrained in pursuing those deals, then they call up their cronies and say, you know, have I got a steel mill for you? It's going on the block. You can have it for a song. In Syria and Iraq, this transition was exacerbated also by the ways in which the societies are composed of religious and ethnic groups. And I think those religious and ethnic divisions now have come to the fore in a big way, but they're not essential. You go back to the 1950s and read the newspapers in Syria and Iraq. Nobody's talking about Sunnis and Shiites. They're worried a lot about communists. And there's something called the Ba'ath Party, which is, you know, Arab nationalist and socialist and anti-imperialist. But even in the U.S. diplomatic documents, if you read them for those era, the real question is, is it going to be a China situation, or the president's going to go communist? But because of the transition to neoliberalism and the way that it was done in a very corrupt way, and the creation of crony capitalists associated with the regime, it starts to matter which ethnic group the cronies are from. Because somebody's getting a lot of the goodies here, and somebody's ox is being gored, and they're being denied services and access to the state. And then people start to mobilize their political, their ethnic identities and religious identities. So in Syria, the revolt against the Ba'ath regime began really with farmers protesting not having enough water. The state wasn't arranging the irrigation properly as it used to. And there was a long-term drought in these regions which has fed into the state collapse, and which may well be a result of climate change. It's not that we've ever had droughts before in the Middle East, but this is a very severe and long-lasting one. And the region is very arid and could be changing. So the farmers, you know, can't make it. And then they go to the cities to look for jobs as day laborers and construction workers. And then the 2008-2009 collapse came along globally, and there just wasn't much construction work to be had. So if you look in Syria, the original protests down in Daraa were water protests by farmers, and in the depot town where the farmers' markets were. And then around this sort of Homs and Hama, the center of Syria, it was in the slums where the workers didn't have jobs, and they had come to find a livelihood having failed as farmers because of the water crisis. So the crisis of global capitalism and the crisis of climate both intersected there in Syria, and similar things happened in Iraq. And of course, Iraq was complicated also by the US invasion of 2003, which is the damn foolest thing this country's ever done, in which the Bush administration overthrew the Ba'ath government, which was, as I said, a socialist government, and despite some Sunni Shiite tensions of some severity in the 90s, there were a lot of Shiite Ba'athists, and so the party had some buy-in across the country. But when the Americans came in, and sometimes they were pushed into it rather than plotting at it, essentially they brought a Shiite elite to power. That Shiite elite wasn't just any old Shiite elite. It was the religious Shiite parties, the ones that were dedicated to making a Shiite religious state, some of them on the Iran model. And these were the people that Paul Bremer, the American viceroy in Iraq, appointed to the interim governing council, people whose parties had been formed by Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in the old days when they were in exile in Iraq. And when the Shiites came to power in a big way, they excluded the Sunnis, and their political ideologies were antithetical to the Sunnis. The Sunnis of Iraq were mostly fairly secular-minded, and this thing of an alliance of convenience with a radical fundamentalist group like ISIL is not representative of where the Sunni Arab community has been in Iraq in the past half century. They've been mostly, would have been reading more Lenin and less say, Qutb, the Egyptian fundamentalist. However, they were put in a situation where they rejected the Shiite and American written constitution. All three Sunni majority provinces rejected that constitution in 2005. They're a minority in a unicameral parliament, which means they're going to lose every vote from here to eternity to a coalition of Shiites and Kurds. So they're a permanent electoral minority. They're pushed to the margins. And then when the Arab Spring came along in 2011 and after, there was a Sunni Arab Spring. So youth in Fallujah and Mosul came out in the city squares and protested. And they wanted political openness of a sort that the hardline Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was not offering them. And the Iraqi government, which, as I said, was in the hands of Shiite fundamentalists, deployed helicopter gunships against these peaceful protesters and crushed the protest movement in the past 3 years in the Sunni Arab areas. Well, if the message is, you've been made unemployed because the Americans and the Shiites together abolished the state factories and other state enterprises that had provided employment in places like Mosul. And unlike what you may have been taught in Economics 101 in America, there is no magic hand that will create an entrepreneur class out of nothing in a place like Iraq if you overthrow the government. So there was just widespread unemployment once they got rid of those state enterprises, in the Sunni Arab areas in particular, and they often even brought their Shiite friends and relatives to fill the jobs of that the Sunnis had been fired from. And Paul Bremer has admitted that it was one of the great mistakes that he made to go along with this Shiite plan to fire the Sunnis from their jobs on the grounds that the Sunnis had been Baathists. So it was something called de-Baathification, and they likened them to Nazis. But they weren't Nazis. And anyway, the Nazis went on in Germany in the 1950s in their same jobs. The Nazi high school teachers, almost none of them were fired. And in fact, if you look at the high political elite of Germany in the 1950s, full of former Nazis. So the Shiite Iraqi line that they were just doing what was done in occupation Germany is not true. And it was very unwise what they did. And they just pushed the Sunnis to the margins. These were the capable people in Iraq. They were the equivalent of West Point graduates and Harvard Law and high politicians and the people who managed things. And they were all told, you're now unemployed. If you behave yourself, you might be able to get a job as a shoe shiner to the Shiites. And so they went into rebellion. And there were Baathist cells that went into rebellion. Secular ones, the leftist ones. Then there are tribal ones, there are neighborhoods, and there are fundamentalist ones, some of them hooked up at some points with al-Qaeda. And what happened really in June of this year was that having tried everything, having been locked out of politics, having been marginalized, having been not given services, and so forth, the remnants of the Baathist elite, the secular Arab nationalist, socialist elite, and some Sufi orders, these are mystical orders in Sunni Islam, in Mosul, made a deal with the devil. ISIL came to them and said, we can rescue you from the Shiites. We'll throw them off. And Mosul and other cities conducted an urban uprising against the Iraqi army. It wasn't that 5,000 ISIL fighters came down and conquered Mosul. They hooked up with Mosul. It was more like a blind date. And what happened really was more like Tahrir Square in Cairo, where the Mubarak government was overthrown by people in the street. The soldiers who ran away were told that it talked about masses coming at them, throwing stones at them. Well, if you've got a city of 2 million people rising up against 70,000 soldiers, it's not clear who takes that one. These soldiers were mostly Shiites from the south, and they were darned if they were going to die way up north in Mosul for the al-Maliki corrupt government, and especially since their officers ran away. So this conflict, which, as I said, seems to me mainly to have been regional and economic, has now been reworked into fundamentalist far-right Shiites versus fundamentalist far-right Sunnis. And in that form, the problem is insoluble, because what's now happened is that the Obama administration has allied with the Shiites and the Kurds to conquer back the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq. And the optics of that are not going to look good. I mean, that's like, allying with the Irish government to conquer England. It would look like Catholics conquering Protestants, right? So I predict dark days ahead.
Well, thank you very much. So what I have to present is some public opinion data. I've been part of a couple of international teams that have been doing surveys in the Middle East, and Iraq is one of the countries in which the surveys have been done. So I have some data from a couple of early surveys from 2004 and 2006, and a couple of later surveys from 2011 and 2013. I'm just going to kind of give you a feel for them. These are kind of descriptive, just quick pictures. I'm not going into a lot of detail, but I think they're actually pretty consistent with the framework that Juan laid out. And I'm happy to talk about methodology if there's interest in it. It's probably not really necessary. You can read up here the main points. These are nationally representative samples. They were done by a very qualified firm, and as I say, I'll be happy to talk more about them. So for one of the first slides, this has to do with sectarianism, and this is part of an interview schedule that has actually quite a large number of questions about sectarian identity. This is just one of them. It's one that's a good predictor of some of the other questions. And the question is simply, are you more concerned about taking care of and defending your own sectarian community, or are you thinking of yourself primarily as an Iraqi, and your goal is to participate in forging an Iraqi national identity? What stands out in this picture is that for all of the groups, less for the Kurds. The Kurds are somewhat divided, and if you know something about Iraq, that's not surprising. But there isn't, kind of consistent with what Juan was saying, there is not a lot of support for my community first. We don't see a lot of expressions of sectarianism. That comes through in some of the other items in the survey as well. And secondarily, while that's true in general, it's even increased. The intensity of that is increased if we compare 2004 and 2006. The distributions are skewed even more toward the national identity and away from the my community dimension. And although the Kurds remain somewhat divided, even they are skewed to some extent in that direction now. Be interesting, there are some analyses that we've done to kind of figure out what are some of the determinants of that, what predicts if someone is going to be more toward one pole or to the other pole. A question that's interesting is to what extent it might be, among other things, a product of a kind of resistance to the American occupation, which was broadly unpopular. But it also has to do with something that Juan was saying, that sectarian identities were not at the forefront of thinking of large numbers of people, and the data seem to support that. Second, we asked them, although this is not really terribly pertinent for today's discussion, we asked them about how they thought about the American forces there. And as you can see, again, there is strong skewing in terms of opposition, even among Shia, and that number gets even more pronounced if we look at 2006 as opposed to 2004. There is not a very favorable impression of what the U.S. is doing there. Kurds that's less true of the Kurds, although they move in the direction of opposition as well, even though they remain divided. But this to give you a little bit of a feel for what the populations were thinking during the early years of the American invasion and occupation, and particularly the absence of strong sectarian sentiments. So moving to the present, I'm just going through this pretty quickly. Moving to not to the present, but to 2011 and 2013, 2 surveys that were done, and you have the dates up there. We asked a couple of different questions. One question was about how you feel about the government. And the question, as you can read, how would you evaluate the performance of the government in carrying out its basic duties and responsibilities? And the second question, which is in the next slide, and that's the last slide, has to do with political Islam, and you'll see some patterns. The pattern here is that the Sunni are skewed toward, very clearly toward a negative view of the government. It's really not very surprising if we know something about Iraq, and really it's consistent with what Juan was saying. It's surprising that goes down a little bit in 2013 from 2011. I'm not sure if that's just a certain amount of sampling variation or if there was some slight decline. But even so, the Sunnis are very much skewed toward the pole of unfavorable attitudes toward the government. The Shia are skewed in the opposite direction, and that increases between 2011 and 2013. As we would probably expect, knowing what was going on in the country and the ascendance of a Shia-dominated regime, that Shia, although there is more division than one might have expected, they're not overwhelmingly of the opinion that the government is doing a good or a very good job. But certainly compared to the other sectarian communities, they're very much in that direction. And the Kurds are somewhat divided and remain somewhat divided, but they move toward a more negative position over the course of this 2-year period between 2011 and 2013. Finally, the last slide, and then I'll just try to summarize some of the takeaways from this. The last slide asks people what they think about the role of Islam in political life. In this battery, this is part of something called the Arab Barometer. We did this battery in 12 different Arab countries. There are actually quite a large number of questions about Islam's political role and the role of the Sharia and a whole series of questions. I picked out one question that's pretty representative of what we would find on most of the other questions. There is a little bit of variation from question to question. And here we see, again, clear sectarian differences. In 2011, in the earliest of the surveys we have, it's the Sunni that overwhelmingly say religious leaders should not influence public government decisions, that express a more separate government and religion and politics kind of point of view, a more secular point of view. And the other two communities are essentially divided. I might say also that division, the Sunnis of Iraq are the outlier here in terms of what we're finding in the Arab Barometer. In general, there is pretty much of a division of opinion about whether Islam should or should not play an important role in political life. And that division is reflected in the other communities. It's very much what we found in most of the other countries with some cross-country variation. But the Sunnis stand out as much more secular in their orientation. If we shift to 2013, kind of referencing the alliance of convenience, I guess that's what we call it, that Juan was talking about, we see that it is the Sunni who are more supportive of, although still divided, more supportive of Islam playing a political role, want Islam to be part of the government process. That's the political formula they endorse more frequently than the other groups. And both of the other two communities have shifted more toward a more secular perspective. So what emerges from this is that sectarianism is not very pronounced in the early years. The various questions we asked to try to get a sense of how important it is to be a Shia as opposed to, or Sunni as opposed to an Iraqi suggest that there is not a lot of sectarianism. Clear differences between the communities emerged during the later period. The predispositions either with respect to evaluation of the government or with respect to the role that Islam should play in political affairs differentiate the communities, with the Sunnis on one end, the Shia on another, and the Kurds kind of in the middle. So if we want to talk more about some of these findings in the Q&A, I'll be happy to do so, but this is to give you a sense for how things look from the ground. Thanks.
Okay, well, good afternoon. It's always nice to be back at my alma mater, and I'd like to thank Professor Pauline Luong for organizing this panel. Now, as someone who studies Islamic thought, I'm interested to know how radical Muslim groups attempt to justify the killing of civilians. And in the brief time that I have, we will examine the discourse of two radical groups, al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda, and ISIS or the Islamic State, ISIL, Daesh, etc. Now, at the outset, I should stress that although the Iraq branch of al-Qaeda was the precursor to ISIS, ISIS and al-Qaeda Central are two distinct organizations. Al-Qaeda has essentially disowned ISIS, and ISIS has attempted to establish a state apparatus. But the differences run deeper. Consider, for instance, ISIS's publicized execution of James Foley and others. ISIS seems to be using publicized executions as a vehicle for enticing potential recruits. As for al-Qaeda, although its terrorist attacks were certainly intended to attract attention, the organization has generally avoided publicizing executions. But whereas al-Qaeda has tended to publicize its discourse by releasing various recordings of its leaders and publishing and posting numerous statements, ISIS thus far has given us relatively little material to work with. That makes analyzing their logic relatively difficult. Nevertheless, despite the profound differences between al-Qaeda and ISIS, we have good reason to assume that both follow ostensibly similar lines of thinking when it comes to their legal justifications for the killing of civilians. So what I'd like to do now is look at how Osama bin Laden attempted to justify the 9/11 attacks within an Islamic legal framework, and then draw comparisons to the only widely broadcast speech by the current leader of ISIS, who goes by the alias Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. First, bin Laden. In 1998, bin Laden and 4 other individuals issued a joint fatwa, or legal opinion, calling on Muslims to fight and kill Americans. Bin Laden and company present this call to arms as a defensive jihad, a defensive struggle against an oppressive force. Bin Laden's 3 specific grievances are: 1, the U.S. military occupation of Saudi Arabia; 2, U.S. support for Israel; and 3, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iraq that allowed for the death of numerous innocent children. 3 years and a few al-Qaeda attacks, terrorist attacks later, 9/11 occurred. Approximately 40 days after the attacks, Al Jazeera interviewed bin Laden. Here is a portion of that exchange. Defending the legitimacy of the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden says, "The killing of innocent civilians, as America and some intellectuals claim, is really very strange talk. Who said that our children and civilians are not innocent and that shedding their blood is justified, that it is lesser in degree. When we kill their innocents, the entire world, from east to west, screams at us, and America rallies its allies, agents, and the sons of its agents, who said that our blood is not blood, but theirs is." The reporter then asks, "So what you are saying is that this is a type of reciprocal treatment. They kill our innocents, so we kill their innocents." Bin Laden, "So we kill their innocents, and I say it is permissible in law and intellectually, because those who spoke on this matter spoke from a juridical perspective." Here he's referring to Muslim jurists, Muslim scholars of Islamic law, who condemned the 9/11 attacks. The reporter asks, what is their position? Bin Laden, that it is not permissible. They spoke of evidence that the messenger of God forbade the killing of women and children. This is true. Reporter, this is exactly what I'm asking about. Bin Laden, however, this prohibition of the killing of children and innocents is not absolute. It is not absolute. He goes on to say, the men that God helped on 9/11 did not intend to kill babies. They intended to destroy the strongest military power in the world, to attack the Pentagon, that houses more than 64,000 employees, a military center that houses the strength and the military intelligence. Reporter, how about the Twin Towers? Bin Laden, the towers are an economic power and not a children's school. Those that were there are men that supported the biggest economic power in the world. They have to review their books. We will do as they do. If they kill our women and our innocent people, we will kill their women and their innocent people until they stop. So, to recap, bin Laden's somewhat contradictory claims are as follows. One, innocent civilians were not targeted on 9/11. Who was targeted? Men, he doesn't mention women, men that supported the biggest economic power in the world. Two, protection of civilians is not absolute. Their deaths are collateral damage. And then three, he goes on to say, it's retaliation. They kill our innocents, so we kill their innocents. Just a little over 2 weeks later, in an interview with Pakistani journalist Hamid Mir, bin Laden asserts that American civilians forfeit their protected or non-combatant status because they pay taxes and elect their president and the Congress. Elsewhere, bin Laden maintains that his method of fighting the United States is a matter of necessity or darura. In other words, he's saying it is necessary to kill American civilians because there is no other way for Muslims to defend themselves against such a powerful foe. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Now, contrary to popular belief, numerous Muslim jurists and leaders from California to Cairo to Qum to Kuala Lumpur condemned the 9/11 attacks in September of 2001. These include some of the most outspoken critics of the United States, such as the ever-controversial jurist Yusuf al-Qaradawi. In fact, if you study Georgetown University's 2009 list of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world, and it's an imperfect list. I think they included an Arab Christian on the list, and they ranked the top 50, I think, and had the King of Morocco at number 3. No offense to Morocco. But if you study the list and you look at these influential Muslims, you would see that the vast majority rejected the 9/11 attacks. And according to a major 2008 Gallup poll, the same is true for Muslims in general. Bin Laden had argued that the 9/11 attacks were retaliatory. According to most Muslim jurists, however, there are limits to retaliation. Bin Laden had asserted that the innocents killed on 9/11 were collateral casualties. According to numerous jurists, however, the collateral casualties justification fails when combatants are not directly targeted. Bin Laden had argued that American civilians who aid and abet the U.S. government forfeit their protected or non-combatant status. According to numerous jurists, however, it takes more than voting and paying taxes for individuals to be deemed legitimate targets. Finally, bin Laden had argued that his method of fighting the United States can be justified through the Islamic legal principle of necessity or darura. According to numerous jurists, however, necessity cannot be invoked to justify heinous acts. And now we turn our attention to ISIS. And of course, everything I have to say about ISIS is tentative, because what I say today might not hold true tomorrow. My focus here will be Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's only widely broadcast speech, a sermon given in Mosul last July. Unlike bin Laden, al-Baghdadi declares himself to be a caliph, or the head of a new Islamic state. But like bin Laden, al-Baghdadi presents his call to arms as a defensive jihad, and one directed against much of the world. He says, "Raise your ambitions, O soldiers of the Islamic State, for your brothers all over the world are waiting for your rescue and are anticipating your brigades. It is enough for you to just look at the scenes that have reached you from Central Africa and from Burma before that. What is hidden from us is far worse. So by Allah, we will take revenge. By Allah, we will take revenge." The message here is that it is us versus the world. Pseudo-Muslims and non-Muslims here and elsewhere are out to get us, so we have to be aggressive in order to defend ourselves. Al-Baghdadi goes on to rebuke critics who describe ISIS as a terrorist organization. If ISIS acts qualify as terrorism, he asserts, then terrorism is to refuse humiliation, subjugation, and subordination. It is to insist upon your rights and not give them up. Then, in an attempt to rebuke the United States and others using sarcasm, he states, "But terrorism does not include the killing of Muslims. All this is not terrorism, rather it is freedom, democracy, peace, security, and tolerance. Implicit here are some of the same justifications for killing that appear in bin Laden's discourse. And of course, we see an explicit call for retaliation. As with 9/11, we find numerous Muslim jurists rejecting ISIS's method of fighting, even if they share many of their grievances. An obvious example of this rejection would be the open letter to al-Baghdadi, which was signed by over 120 prominent Muslim jurists and leaders. Although it appears that the vast majority of Muslims reject ISIS, it is an organization that continues to attract new members who find the call for revenge compelling, especially in the fragile Iraqi and Syrian contexts, where you have many Sunnis who view various non-Sunni and even other Sunni factions with suspicion and contempt. Therefore, as it stands now, the most that Sunni jurists can hope to do is limit, not terminate, but limit the ideological influence of ISIS. To be sure, the fight against ISIS will require more than Muslim jurists simply condemning them. As Professor Cole has indicated, there are, of course, many issues beyond the purview of Islamic law that must be addressed and redressed. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about this in a rather different perspective, to look at it from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. grand strategy, and to what extent the concerns about ISIS and the actions the U.S. is currently taking in Iraq and Syria fit into that. So, where I want to start with first is a little bit of talk about general principles here. Being a political scientist, I like to talk about those things. And here's an observation that the international system is both shaped by the domestic institutions of states and shapes them in turn. So we have an interdependence of the two. And in specific, the principles and the norms that exist in the international system are in part created and enforced over time because they help national leaders address the issues that help them to maintain power domestically. I'll give you a few examples of this in a little bit. At the same time, domestic politics matters because it helps to create the incentives that leaders face in international politics. That is, they take actions in international politics in part to advance the interests of their people within their country whose interests they purport to advance. And so the two of them are then interdependent, that they're not easily separable. And in particular, the basis of the legitimacy of the state, why the state exists, whose interests it serves, what it does, influences what norms and principles can be created and sustained in international politics. That is, the character of international politics overall. So here are the questions about why does the state exist and what is its purpose? That helps to shape the aims of the state because that understands what citizens expect from their state and how their leaders then will try and meet those expectations in ways that will allow them to do this. It also influences things because it affects the ability of the state to extract resources from the population that in turn give it power internationally. Or to put it another way, international norms then, in some sense, advance the purpose of the state. And this is one reason why they're contested in world politics generally, is that they have real consequences both internationally and domestically. Okay, so where I want to start with to think about US global strategy then is to talk about competing models of state legitimacy in the world today. The first of those is the one that in some sense has created many of the principles that undergird the world, which is the Western model. This is a belief in liberal democracy as the way to organize politics with free markets. Now, there's a lot of variation across Western states in how these principles get worked out, but it's an idea that there's a marriage of both free politics and free economics. This has consequences for what the international order looks like. It advocates for an open economic international order, for example, because you can then get the gains of international exchange through trade and finance and other ways that help advance economic interests in those free economies. A second model is what I don't have a great word for it, but I call it high-performing autocracies. These are authoritarian governments, so they reject the idea of liberal democracy, but that engage in the market economy internationally. If you want the two primary examples of this in current world politics, they would be China and Singapore. That is, that they don't accept the international principles that go with liberal democracy, such as various notions of human rights, but they wish to engage in international interchange because they find that beneficial, because it helps to advance the state. A third model here we could think of as popular authoritarianism. And this is one in which the leader claims that they represent national interests and that they don't actually have to hold free and fair elections, because if they did, they would be elected anyways because they're sufficiently popular. And this is predominantly a nationalistic vision, which is also typically very heavily statist, in the sense that the state is heavily involved in the economy and influences who wins and loses. If you want to think of the two primary models of this in current world politics, they would be Russia and Venezuela. And the fourth model is Islamicist, which is here the principle in some sense is the claim that the government exists to embody or to foster the ideal order, which is based on Islam. And this is where ISIS fits in, because it's not the only version of the Islamicist state out there. The Islamic Republic of Iran is another very different one, but it's a very extreme example of this particular form. Okay, now the thing is, these different four visions of the state imply different types of international orders. And they explain why certain issues continue to be contested in world politics today, such as the opposition between human rights versus state sovereignty that we find between those in the West versus that second model, the high-performing autocracy, and the third model, the popular nationalist. It's also questions about the openness of the global economy, because those first two types of systems are quite happy to have an open global economy, whereas the third and fourth generally are opposed to that. Then what makes ISIS particularly important in this model as a very extreme version of the Islamicist model is it poses a transnational challenge to the order created by the US and the West. Now that seems very far away from us, and at the moment it is, but that's in an ideological sense how it fits in the larger picture here. But of course the question is, this is far away, the other side of the world. Does this actually require a response by the United States and the West? And here's where we get into the tough part of foreign policy, which is the practical politics. Is that taking actions to enforce those different international norms involves lots of different flows of costs and benefits. And many of the things that you would like to do to advance interests or values that we place a very, very strong weight on may simply be too costly to engage in. And therefore, foreign policy is involved in the marriage of the practical politics of what you can do in the world with advancing the principles that you think are important in ordering the world. And so in that sense, that although the West may advance a certain vision, that does not mean that you should therefore go out and take all possible actions to advance that vision. And in particular, what are the practical considerations involved in any sort of large-scale intervention against ISIS? Well, first of these is that there's very little domestic support in the United States for any imposition of a large-scale ground force, again, in the Middle East. That to the extent that there is any support domestically, the Obama administration does not appear to have the slightest interest in trying to rally that opinion and make such a case for that. And I think that's an accurate reflection. And that matters because in a democracy, if you don't have popular support for those positions in foreign policy, you will not be able to persist in them over long periods of time. Secondly, there are the difficulties of actually intervening in the region, which is the combination of course, the Syrian civil war and also the ongoing fighting in Iraq, and the difficulties of the Turks, who probably could play the largest role here, and their ambivalence about what side to be involved in. I particularly like this because this is an example that the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is not true in all cases. All right, so what is to be done? The key thing to realize is that at a fundamental level, from the point of view of the West, this is an ideological struggle. The good news is that in the long run, democracies are actually good in winning these contests. If you think back to the Cold War, in some sense, the Western vision defeated the communist vision as propounded by the Soviet Union, primarily on an ideological level. And that eventually those who lived in the Soviet Union and its satellite states came to believe that the communist system was not good and abandoned it. Now, the second part of the good news here is that ISIS's ideology, its extreme version of Islamicism, is likely to prove unpopular to most in the region. So that those who welcome ISIS, as Juan accurately described, or earlier this year, they're likely to feel less comfortable about this as the reality of what governance by ISIS looks like. Now's the downside of this, is that this takes decades, however. And the second hard part of it I didn't put on my slide is this is something that the West can influence only very, very indirectly. That the essential ideological solution to the problem is for Muslims to come to figure out for themselves how to reconcile properties of good governance and the like with their religion. And that's not one that the West can tell them how to do it. It's one they have to discover for themselves. All right, so then what is the policy here? Well, the other problem with waiting decades for this is that ISIS is in a position that they could do a great deal of damage in the short run. And given their acquisition of a substantial amount of heavy equipment with the routing of large numbers of Iraqi army units this summer, they've acquired a lot of heavy equipment. So what we have is practically a strategy that says that what we want to do is level the battlefield. That to engage in low-cost military intervention that will enable the United States to reduce the imbalance in force between the two sides so that local forces can contest ISIS. And that finally brings me to my last point, which is actually where the problem in U.S. in what the Obama administration has done. It's not the policy. The policy makes a lot of sense in this setting. It's the disconnect between the policy and the rhetoric. And that President Obama would quite correctly, when in his address, said that we seek to degrade ISIS, but then went and added the other DE, which was to destroy it. Because the point is, the rhetoric is different from the policy. There's no interest in the United States in pursuing a course of action that would actually destroy ISIS. And the danger in the disconnect is I can already see the next release from ISIS in, say, a year, quoting President Obama about how the United States intended to destroy ISIS with a sort of a message of, we're still here. Thank you.
Thank you again to each of our four panelists. I now have a set of questions on the side. Others want to ask questions, please write your questions down in your card and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Right now I want to start with a few questions that were sent from our Dearborn campus. They're watching via live stream. And I want to make sure that their questions are heard. I'm going to go ahead and just give three of them to the panelists, and we'll start with that and have you respond to the ones you feel comfortable responding to. The first question is, how is ISIS being received or framed or interpreted by Islamist political groups and parties in the region? The second is, does ISIS have a political or civilian or diplomatic arm? If so, how do they try and engage with other countries' official, international, or regional diplomatic representatives? Actually, there are four questions. Sorry about this. The third is, do we have any sense of how many former Iraqi military officers are serving in or supporting the ISIS campaign? Are they integrated into ISIS or affiliated more indirectly? And finally, the fourth question is, are there signs of resistance to ISIS in the areas they control? If so, what groups or individuals are resisting? So I'm going to turn to the panelists, and anyone wants to respond to one or more of those, or not to respond at all, that's fine. I'll then go to other questions. Thanks. Do you want to come up here?
I think from here is good. So I don't have an answer to, a good answer to all those questions, but we do know from our surveys in the Arab world that support for Islam playing a political role is decreasing pretty substantially and pretty significantly. There's some variation from country to country, but as a result of what's happened during the Arab Spring and subsequent events, the rise to power of Islamist governments in a number of really key countries, Tunisia and Egypt, popular discontent with those governments, fueled perhaps in part by some things that the old regime did, but basically by the poor performance of the governments themselves, and those governments falling from power. And most recently we had an election in Tunisia where the quote-unquote secularists, that's probably not the best term, won. I think it's a pretty good it's pretty good to infer from this that support for Islamist government, and by extension, ISIS would be evaluated on a bunch of different levels, not just in terms of their Islamic ideology and their Islamic assertions. But I think it's fair to say that support for what they represent is way down. The one other point I would make is that we do know that they've been pretty successful in attracting individuals from some of these countries to go to ISIS and join as fighters. And although this is somewhat anecdotal, we know the classes out of which those people are coming. They're not people with Islamic education or coming out of Islamic movements. They're essentially the dispossessed and the unemployed. So there isn't a lot of evidence that the Islamic message and what ISIS represents in that sense is finding broad support. There is some support for resistance to, especially since the U.S. has started bombing, to the extent that we don't have a good reputation in the area, and people who are seen as resisting us get a certain amount of support just by virtue of that. But in the context of the question that was asked, is this a model or an experience that draws a lot of support on its face, given its mission? I would say we're pretty confident saying the answer to that is no.
Can I say that the Arabic press throughout the region views ISIL and so-called Caliph Abu Bakr as crackpots. I mean, the atmosphere in the region is it's sort of as though, you know, the Ku Klux Klan had taken over an American state and the leader, the Grand Wizard, had declared himself the Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, this is not, with all due respect to my colleague, not at all like Iran. It doesn't have the legitimacy that the Islamic State of Iran has managed to establish for itself. It's viewed as a gang, you know, that happens to have managed to take over some territory in places where the state collapsed. So even the movements of political Islam in the region, whether it's the Nahda or Renaissance Party in Tunisia, which just lost the election in favor of secularists there, or the Muslim Brotherhood, even Hamas in Gaza, they all condemn these guys as a bunch of crazies who are, and the phrase is used that they're putting Islam in a bad light. People are actively embarrassed about them. And I don't know of any major pre-existing political grouping in the region that approves of them or speaks well of them or is willing to ally with them openly, including al-Qaeda, which has repudiated them. So they're just viewed as wild men, as outlaws, and not as having any legitimacy at all in the region. And a poll was done in Syria of how many Syrians thought that ISIL represented them, and it was 2%. You have to worry about the 2%, but I think that's typical.
Well, I'll add just a few quick comments on some of these. In terms of how they act inside territories, they want to try and act like a state. And therefore they do things like try to collect taxes, try and generate government revenue, try to carry out justice and the like. And in that sense, they do try and act like a state. Their relations, to the extent we've heard about them with other Syrian rebel groups that are opposed to the Assad regime, are not very pleasant. That in fact, a lot of their rise came about from wars over control of local areas inside Syria. As to the fourth question about resistance to ISIS inside the areas they've occupied, you hear stories about this, but they're stories, and one has no idea how widespread these are. And this is not one where one can easily run an opinion poll.
There are several questions regarding Turkey and Turkey's role, as well as the role of the Kurds and the impact it's going to have on the Kurds. So I'm going to just read a sampling of those questions and hope that those of you who asked other questions that are similar get your, at least a sampling of your question heard. So two on the role of Turkey. First, for all of the panelists, what do you think about the role of Turkey in the crisis in Syria and Iraq? How does the secular system support this fundamentalist group? How do you evaluate Turkey as a role model, democratic and secular, in the war against ISIS? Can we trust Turkey as a reliable partner? I think Professor Morrow talked about this a bit in the fight against ISIS. Why can we not, if we cannot, why can we not rely on Turkey as a reliable partner? And now on the Kurds and the role of the Kurds, what are the chances of the Kurds getting an independent state as a result of Iraq and Syria's failure? And given the fierce Kurdish resistance to ISIS's advances in northern Iraq and Syria, what are the prospects for an independent Kurdish state? There was also a question to Professor Tessler in particular about Kurdish attitudes and why their attitudes were related only to their sectarian identity as opposed to their ethno-national identity. If you could speak a little bit about the sampling of the Kurds in the Kurdish areas of Iraq. Would any of you like to speak to any of the questions about Turkey? You can,
Well,
of course, have the right of view. This is democracy.
No, I'll say a little bit about Turkey. I think part of Turkey's perspective is the United States a reliable ally for them? They have a problem that they live in the neighborhood, and that they have much more at stake than outside powers do, which I think is part of their diffidence about being involved. Is they're afraid that basically everyone else will want them to do the heavy lifting.
Well, and we know that a couple of things that are driving Turkish assessments in this and their willingness or unwillingness to ally with us is the priority they attach to opposing the Assad regime in Syria, and in particular their worry that strengthened Kurdish forces will end up opposing, will be a force for more autonomy or even potentially independence for Kurds inside. So it's exactly what Juan said. The enemy of the friend of my enemy is not necessarily the enemy of my enemy.
Yeah, right.
Well, anyway, what he said is right.
Are you done?
Yes.
So with regard to Turkey, the thing to remember is that the current Justice and Development Party of Turkey tried very hard to be friends with Bashar al-Assad. This is not a situation where you can read off from political ideology, because the Justice and Development Party, you can't call it an Islamist party. It's a party which has some Islamists in it, but it's a party that made its way in Turkey by advocating for a kind of multiculturalism. You know how in the American right there's this myth about a war on Christmas and that religious people are somehow marginalized in the United States today and so forth. And that myth actually is true in Turkey. That is, religious people were marginalized in Turkey, and there was a war on the equivalent of Christmas. And secularists were in power there. And the Justice and Development Party was a vehicle for people to reassert themselves who were religious, but it didn't have as its goal overturning the traditions of the 20th century Turkish secularism in the main, maybe at the margins. But it wasn't like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or like the Khomeinists in Iran who wanted, Islamic law as interpreted by medieval jurists to be the law of the land and so forth. So they were perfectly happy to cooperate with the secular Baath government in Turkey, in Syria, and indeed they had big plans for a kind of Turkish economic imperium in the Middle East. They vastly expanded their trade in the Arab world, which was on top of the trade with Europe. So they added about 25% to their trade by reaching out to places like Syria. So when the Arab Spring broke out and the Syrian people rose up against the regime, the Assad regime decided to deal with this by drawing up tanks and firing tank shells into the middle of civilian peaceful demonstrations and just killing people. Or they put snipers up on the roofs of buildings and fired into the middle of the demonstrations. And they would kill like 8 per demonstration. It was very clear that they had a kind of quota to try to scare people from coming back out, in which they failed. But as things ratcheted forward, the fact that the Alawite Shiites dominated the upper echelons of the government and many of the protesters were Sunni Arabs from the center of the country made it increasingly look like a sectarian struggle. And the Justice and Development Party represents the Sunni, sort of more committed Sunnis of Turkey. So it was impossible for them to stand with al-Assad in this situation. They would have alienated their own right wing, the Justice and Development Party, and so they decided that Assad had to go. But Assad going is a big problem because the Ba'ath regime was a guarantor of stability there. What would happen if the 2 million Kurds in northeast Syria spin off and become independent? That's a problem for Turkey, which is afraid of its own Kurdish separatists and that the country could get divided by ethnic lines. What happens if al-Qaeda takes over Syria and the Justice and Development Party is, what our analysts would call moderate Islam, so they're afraid of al-Qaeda and have cracked down on it in Turkey and so forth. So I think the analysis is exactly right. They don't exactly know what to do about all this. They want Assad to go, and they want people like themselves, kind of secular-minded, open-minded Muslims to come to power in Syria, and they don't know how to make that happen. And as the religious, the rebels have taken on a more and more radical coloration, the Turks have kind of held their nose and continued to support the rebels, but I think that it's gone in a direction that really puzzles them what to do about it. And so the United States has gone to Turkey and said, see here, we expect you to be an ally in this push against ISIL. And the Turks have said, yes, we'll do that, but then there's no follow through, and they're clearly worried still about the Kurds and alienating their own Sunnis, and all of these considerations kind of paralyze them.
One other point about Turkey. So as I was saying, that there's something of a division in the Middle Eastern Muslim world about whether Islam should or should not play an important role in political life, and whether an Islamic political formula is the right political formula. That's shrinking. It's shifting toward the people who want Islam out of politics, people who are very devout and for whom religion is very important, but leave it out of politics. But if we ask the people who do want Islam, who do embrace an Islamist political formula, well, is there a country that kind of represents what you think might be a good model? Most will say Turkey. Very few will say Iran, just as a kind of side note. And I wasn't sure about the question about the Kurds that I was asked.
Just asking you, maybe the student or the person who asked the question can come to you afterwards.
Sure.
Talk to you one-on-one, but asking more detail about whether the Kurds were referring to their sectarianism or their ethno-nationalism, sort of trying to parse out.
Yeah, I'm not sure we asked the question that way, but it's clear the Kurds have, in terms of where they live and in terms of the language they speak, that they've got more of an identity on their own, and even under Saddam, I think that was true to some extent. In terms of the sample, they came up in appropriate proportions in a nationally representative sample.
Does anyone have anything to say about the process for an independent Kurdish state? That came up a couple of times in the questions.
About an independent Kurdish state in northern Iraq?
Right.
Yeah. Well, the Kurds in northern Iraq are independent. They're the Taiwan of the Middle East. They're independent in every way that matters. The Iraqi National Army can't set foot in Kurdistan. When you fly to Erbil, they stamp your passport, Kurdistan, there's no mention of Iraq. They're doing oil deals without going through Baghdad. They're a state. They're independent. But it's like Taiwan. If you say that publicly, it causes a war. So we can't talk about it. There's a one Iraq policy. When ISIL took over Mosul, and the Iraqi army ran away from the north, the Kurds inherited Kirkuk, which they have wanted for a long time. They have 3 of the old Iraqi provinces, and they want the 4th. They now have it, de facto. And Masoud Barzani, the president of Kurdistan, announced that they would have a referendum in 6 months on independence. He was just going to go for it and use ISIL as the pretext to go for it. But then ISIL made a move on Erbil, and the Peshmerga didn't really do very well. We were all surprised because they were supposed to be good fighters. And it was clear that Erbil needed the Americans to come in to save them. And the Americans told them, well, we could save you, but we don't like this independence business. That's going to cause trouble for our NATO ally Turkey, and it'll cause trouble for Saudi Arabia because minus Kurdistan, Iraq is a very Shiite country. So we want you not to declare independence. And the Americans have come in and bombed ISIL and pushed them back from Erbil, and all that talk about Kurdistan independence has gone away. So, Iran doesn't want it to be independent, Turkey doesn't want it, the United States doesn't want it, Syria doesn't want it, so on and so on and so forth. It's very hard to do, but they have it de facto anyway.
Okay, did you want to comment?
No.
I have 3 questions that are specifically for Professor Khalil. First, how seriously should we consider the objective of establishing a worldwide caliphate on the part of either ISIS or al-Qaeda? Second, how accurately is Western media reporting the facts of what is occurring within worldwide Muslim communities? I'm not sure anybody can answer that definitively, but maybe you can try. Given your training, you're going to get told, yes? Third, it may be that Islamic leaders have condemned ISIS, yet why is it that ISIS is such a stronger ongoing voice in social media, be it its propaganda in relation to condemnations by Islamic leaders? So why are they getting more press than those that are condemning them? That's a great question. And finally, if the whole world sees ISIS as terrorists, why do we continue to use the word Islamist?
Could you say that last question again?
If the whole world sees ISIS as terrorists, why do we continue to use the word Islamist?
Okay.
Others could comment on these questions as well, if they were directed to this.
Sure. Sure. So the worldwide caliphate, yeah, I mean, I don't think that they'll ever succeed. They don't have enough support, and I don't think they have the means to do that. But certainly, just the mere intention, the mere desire to do this, to establish this, we already see what's going on with ISIS. I mean, it's a cause for concern, obviously. The media, yeah, there are some issues there. Media portrayal of Islam, obviously. The issue of, let me answer the last question about ISIS. Why do we refer to it as Islamist? Islamist, this is a term that we use to refer to individuals and groups that think of Islam as a political ideology. And so they certainly would qualify as Islamist using that understanding, that terminology. But they would, of course, be radical Islamists. Islamist does not mean terrorist, right? So they would be radical Islamists. And of course, this terminology, I mean, I'm not so happy, I'm not so excited about some of these terms that we use, even like the term jihadist. I think that actually encourages people. Maybe harabist would be a more appropriate term, where you're saying that they're guilty of haraba, which is the most severely punishable crime in Islamic law. As for ISIS's popularity, perhaps my colleagues will have something to say about this. Certainly Professor Tessler already mentioned, that we see people from the West who are attracted to ISIS, who maybe they just converted or they don't have much background in Islam, who are attracted to ISIS because of its message. It's, there's certainly an attraction there. But I'll defer to my colleagues to sort of take it from there.
I'll add a quick comment about, the other thing to understand about their strategy, because they recruit transnationally, they don't have to be popular with very many people to succeed. There's about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. If they recruit 1 out of 100,000, that's 15,000 recruits. And so in one sense, if you think about that as a recruiting strategy, part of it is they're very happy to lay out a very extreme vision because it is in part a recruiting tool for a certain segment of the people. And it doesn't have to respond or be seen as legitimate in the eyes of very many people to be able to sustain that sort of authoritarian power.
There's been a little work. I'm thinking about attraction from Arab countries. And I'm thinking in particular of Tunisia, which is actually, surprisingly maybe, the country that has the largest number of foreign fighters in Syria or Iraq with ISIS. While there's a lot more work to be done, it appears, this is sort of what I said before, it appears that these people are coming out of the really disadvantaged sector of society where people don't have much hope of a good future, are looking for something to identify with. There have been some studies in terms of how some of them are recruited and how people who go there send text messages back and try to tell them it's an important cause. So we know something about it, and it isn't really about Islam. I think that's the main point I would want to make, and that it's the resistance or it's the promise of a better life, and maybe for some, the idea of dying and having something better in the afterlife. I don't know if that's completely absent, but it's not that they're sending out these messages and everybody says, oh, well, that's what Islam is, and gee whiz, now I know I'm off. I mean, it's really not about that.
Yeah, there's no support for a revived caliphate in the Muslim world. The polling on this is very clear. There hasn't been actually a caliphate since 1258 when the Mongols took Baghdad. Apparently, it was considered bad luck in medieval Islam to shed the blood of a caliph. So the Mongols had this problem of how to kill him. They rolled him up in a Persian carpet and beat him with hammers. That was the last real caliph. He didn't end well. And since then, there have just been empires and states and kings and more recently republics. And Sunni Islam has managed to deal with this. And I would argue that actually what's happened in the last 150 years is that in ways we haven't recognized, Sunni Islam has been Protestantized. So they don't have strong religious hierarchies in Sunni Islam. Their ulama or clerics are more like Protestant pastors than anything else. And each country organizes the jurisconsults and the religion in a way. So there's a mufti of Egypt and a mufti of Syria and so forth. So it's very much like Lutheranism, you have Swedish Lutheranism and German Lutheranism. And so that's the way Sunni Islam is now organized. It's organized on a national basis. And what ISIL represents is a tiny lunatic fringe that's fighting against this Protestantization of Sunni Islam and saying, no, we should have a United States of Islam and there should be a revived caliphate from the Ottoman period typically, or the medieval period, and so forth. But it's not a widespread aspiration, and frankly, the Ibrahim Samarai, who has a two-bit PhD from the University of Baghdad, is not going to be the one that will inspire this vision in any case. So it's really, the whole thing is nonsensical. The only reason ISIL, we're sitting here talking about it, is the Syrian state collapsed, and then the Iraqi state decided to badly mistreat its Sunnis and shell them from the air and with helicopter gunships and drive them into the arms of even the lunatic fringe. I don't expect them to have any staying power. I think the main people involved in this movement are likely to be dead within 5 years. Putin doesn't want them there, Iran doesn't want them there, Syria doesn't want them there, Baghdad doesn't want them there, the United States doesn't want them there, the UK, France. So after a while, they won't be there.
Do you want to ask anyone? No. So I'm just going to ask a few more questions. Again, our sampling of lots of questions that are being asked, and then I'm going to allow the panelists to decide whether they want to answer specific questions or just have a summation of their remarks. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So there are a number of questions about the role of other countries, not just Turkey, but other countries like Saudi Arabia in the growth and development of ISIS. I don't know if others want to remark on that. Specifically, one person wrote, can you talk a little bit more about ISIS's interaction with states in the region? Do any of them directly support the actions of ISIS? Who are its enemies and who are its friends in the region? That's a broad question. And then there are questions about strategies that the U.S. can use other than ground troops or bombing. Is it possible for the U.S. to limit the funding that ISIS receives? How does ISIS generate so much revenue? What legal political barriers are present to limiting their ability to generate revenue? And then there's a question too about whether or not they can limit their ability to recruit through social media and otherwise. But we've touched on that a bit. So are those questions that you want to address specifically, or if you want to make sort of general remarks in the last few minutes?
I'd just say on the revenue front that I believe the U.S. government has tried to do some things about this. I mean, there's revenue sources. There are some donations. I don't think that's a large part of it. They captured a huge amount of money when they overran parts of northwestern Iraq. They also have captured oil wells, and they smuggle oil out through other places. And in fact, that's, I believe, one of the main reasons why one of the recent targets of U.S. airstrikes were some of those oil wells and refineries in an attempt to try and reduce that ability to raise money through oil.
Yeah, the wealth of ISIL has been vastly exaggerated by the press, especially compared with other such movements. So, well, 6 or 7 years ago, during the Iraq War, the New York Times estimated that $5 billion a year was being smuggled in Iraqi petroleum out of refineries in Basra by Shiite militias like the Mahdi Army. These are groups, by the way, which are actively now fighting ISIL in Iraq. So my guess is that the Shiite militias in Iraq are on the order of 10 times more well-funded than ISIL is. Raw petroleum is not useful to anybody. If I brought you a bucket of crude oil, you probably wouldn't give me anything for it. If I brought you a bucket of gasoline and I sold it to you for, well, I could let you have it for $1.50 a gallon, say. You'd buy it. That's what ISIL's doing. And the way you deprive them of that income is you take away the control of the refineries and the trucking routes from them. So Turkey had built 12 small refineries in Syria. I think it was in al-Raqqa province, which ISIL captured. And so the U.S. has been bombing those. They won't be there after a while. And the ISIL also has a position near the Beji refinery in Iraq, and I think they're able to capture some of the gasoline trucks from it. But you know, denying them the money from smuggling oil, I think wouldn't be so hard, or at least denying them most of it. But then aside from these kinds of sources of income, they also appear to get big money from far right-wing billionaires in the Gulf who are, have made their money in the oil industry and who have a very narrow vision of what society should be, and they're not able to assert themselves in Kuwait or the UAE in the way that they would like. So they're imagining a dreamland of Salafi Syria, and they send the money to ISIL. And the U.S. Treasury Department now has sanctioned 3 Kuwaiti businessmen who we think were involved in this. But there are lots more, and there's a lot of money sloshing around the Gulf, and there are a lot of people with way too much time on their hands. I think the Treasury Department is going to have to take more measures in this regard.
Would others like to comment on this question, or maybe just wrap up with final remarks?
That's fine.
Is there a question that from the audience that's not written down on the picture? Okay. Go ahead, Joe.
Is there any recommendations for improving the situation? Getting out?
He wants to end on a high note. Yeah. Is there a way out? Except to wait.
Well, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think it's good that it's asked and that people reflect on it. But I think one of the things that needs to happen, that maybe we're sort of trying to make happen, is that the people who are willing to hold, I mean, the people who are in the areas controlled by ISIS, who are willing or who feel they have no choice but to hold their nose and make an alliance with them or support them, need to have alternatives. And that means a different kind of political configuration and system of government in Baghdad, in which Sunni as well as everybody else can find themselves. That's not terribly original, because we've been saying that and we're pushing for that. And there are forces on the other side pushing against Iran, for example. But I think I mean, there's both the inside and the outside story. I mean, to what extent can we, is there more we can do to prevent people from going there, but limit their ability to recruit? Yeah, I'm working with some governments to try to do that, but there are going to be limits. To what extent can we change the political equations in Iraq so people are making different kinds of calculations? That's easier to say than to do, and even to spell out exactly what that would mean is kind of hard. But I think we know that part of their success has been that some of the territory they've captured, they've had support from the local population, given the things that some of us have talked about, how things look from the point of view of Sunnis in the areas where they've come in and successfully chased the Shia army out. The only other thing I would say by way of a concluding comment is it'd be nice to kind of figure out a way to divorce, and maybe this is not possible, maybe this is a question for my colleague here, but to remove Islam from some of this discussion, or to put it in a more restricted kind of context, as opposed to coming back, well, is this what Islam is really about? Well, yeah, sort of, but on the other hand, there are Islamic clerics that condemn it. In a way, we shouldn't be having that conversation. We should kind of recognize that it's really an aberration by self-appointed people. You may or may not think they have some legitimate causes given the way the Sunnis have suffered at the hands of the Shia in recent years, which is the opposite of the way the Shia suffered at the hands of Saddam in an earlier period. But to kind of keep coming back, and we haven't really done this, but it kind of is in the air when people in the US talk about it. So we're getting all these different images of Islam, and maybe they're all sort of legitimate in a certain way, and this is one of the legitimate messages, even though it's not the only one. It'd be nice if we could kind of take that out of the equation.
I could not agree more. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.